Well, hey everybody, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. You're here on Zoom or on Facebook or catching us at some point in the future, but we are here on the backstage. That's what we call this as a project, a special project of resilientchurchleadership.com. And I'm Mindy Caliguire. I'm co-founder of soulcare.com and involved in the senior leadership at Glue. And each week, as you've been with us, you know, we love to focus on what is true about the life of a leader in the backstage of their life. So much of our leadership events and blogs and great content is focused on the front stage. How are you doing what you do? How do you do it better, stronger, faster, all those things. And those are valuable conversations. But we find that what's going on in the backstage or behind the scenes of a leader's life is actually more important to what's going on the front stage than almost any of those other kinds of things. So we just love to have this little corner of Thursdays, if you're with us live, or this corner of the web, where you can come and find some inspiration, we hope, and some really practical helps for your own soul in the midst of your leadership. And as it goes with your leadership, we believe healthy leaders lead to having healthy churches or ministries, and healthy churches and ministries really can change their communities for the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we're glad you're with us. This week, we are so excited to have a fun friend, a new friend, guest, Tish Harrison Warren. You may be familiar with her books, which have been very, very popular. She's the author of Liturgy of the Ordinary, Sacred Practices in Everyday Life, which was Christianity Today's 2018 Book of the Year. So pretty significant body of work there. And a more recent book called Prayer in the Night for those who work and watch and weep. Warren has a master's in theology from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. She's a priest in the Anglican Church in North America and currently serves as writer in residence at Resurrection Church, South Austin. So we've asked her to join us today, speaking to pastors and leaders, although she writes for all of us, but especially as we navigate through these days that are still difficult in the pandemic. So before we get started, really would encourage you to like, if you're on Facebook with us, like and share today's conversation. And as always, we love hearing from you during this. We love to be interactive. Tish and I were talking about this earlier. We would love to be able to interact with you. So comments, questions, all of those things are welcome, and we'd love to hear from you and have you be part of the conversation today. I actually first became familiar with her work when her book in 2018 was submitted as a potential book of the year. And Tish, I loved getting to write a review of it. I don't know if my review ever showed up anywhere, but the work that was significant was yours in that book, and it was so fabulous. So just before we get into that, welcome to the backstage. We're so glad you're here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Where are you joining us from today? Are you in Austin right now?
Yeah, I am in, we just moved here like in the last month. So I'm in the Austin area. I'm actually in a small town outside of Austin. And, but yeah, so right around where I grew up in Austin, that's where I'm from. So awesome. I moved back home. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, good. I bet it feels kind of surreal to be back in the community after all the other things you've done in the intervening years. And
yeah, it's actually right now we have moved back to the home that my grandparents lived in, and so it really does feel like after I've gone and done many things, and then I've sort of come back. So.
Your grandparents' home? That's incredible.
Yeah.
Awesome. There's a lot of history there. Well, I just want to say thank you again for that book that you wrote now several years ago. I know sometimes books can kind of be a far away in the rearview mirror, but the way that book was framed and everything in it makes me think that you were just writing about your life, and you were writing about the ordinary ways that we can encounter God in those moments of life. And so I just thought, before we get into some of the things that are more current for you and for me and for, I think, all of us, just indulge me for a minute, since I never had the chance to meet you during that process. I'm just so curious, what were some of your favorite parts of that book as you were telling stories about marriage and motherhood and ministry? Like what's one little glimpse that was a fun part for you in that book?
Yeah. So the book, you might have just heard my baby just screamed in the background. It was like on cue for this question, but don't worry, he's my husband's home, so there is a parent taking care of him. So in terms of parts of the book that I liked, I mean, it's hard to, when you write a book, you can't, it's hard to pick a favorite part. It's like picking a favorite child. You made all of it, you know, all the faults and the good parts of all of it. But for me, I feel like chapter 6, which is the chapter on fighting with my husband.
That was my favorite.
The husband. Well, in many ways, that's sort of the crux of the book, of figuring out what do these big ideas of seeking shalom look like in my life, and so that, and then the chapter 4 about losing my keys. I liked that chapter a lot. In ways, I feel like that chapter, without knowing it, I had no idea at the time, but teed up the ideas in my second book, just because it was about what does suffering look like on this like very small scale. How do I react to brokenness in my own life, like and when it's insignificant, right? And I say something in the book like, you know, I've been trained in times of like high, like tragedy to look for God, but what about just the kind of ordinary daily suffering that and I say something like, you know, the idea of being content in all circumstances sounds easier to me in a shipwreck than it does like going on 3 days of little sleep and, you know, a sink that backs up. And so
right.
So there's things, a lot of times I put more on the page than I knew that I knew. So I learned through writing. So I don't have the ideas. This is actually in many ways the difference between like a writer and non-writers, is I don't come up with my thoughts and then write my thoughts down. I write my thought. I think with my hands. I think by writing. And so so that I just feel like in chapter 4 I learned a lot about my own sort of struggles and in ways that teed me up for the future. I feel like the chapter that's resonated a lot with people is chapter 6, the one about fighting with my husband, but also the chapter on the church, which is, I think it's called like, it's calling a friend, and it's like community and congregation. And I get a lot of comments on it. And the one on beauty, actually, the one on drinking a cup of tea and enjoying pleasure. I've gotten a lot of comments on that chapter as well. But it's been fun. I mean, it was Liturgy of the Ordinary is my first book, and it was really life-changing. And I think it's in 7 languages now or so, and I've gotten letters from folks all over and places I never expected, you know. Beautiful. Like so that's been fun too, just to see the reception. I mean, with your first book, you're just hoping, like, you're like counting, you're like, okay, if my mom buys like 20 copies, and you're like trying to get up to the advance, you know. So particularly because it was a, you know, the book it's about the ordinary, but it's also very much about liturgy and about formative practices. I just honestly didn't know how it would go over, and folks have read it that I never expected to. I mean, the men's group at John Piper's church read it, which I'm an Anglican priest, and that's a Baptist church, right? And an Amish community in Ireland read it together. So it's just gone places I never expected. People have found it and benefited from it that were not my target audience, and that's been really it's been lovely. I mean, it's just a gift. It's like a complete shocking unexpected gift.
Well, I'm so glad that that's been the reception. I'm not at all surprised. And for those of you who are listening, I really do recommend that you pick this up, and it'll feel, it was pre-pandemic, so it doesn't have any of the weight of our last year.
There's no face mask at all. There's no liturgy of face masking in the book.
Yeah, those will be coming down the road, but
it was pre so much. The world's changed so much. It was pre-Trump. It was it came out in 2017. The book released, I think, a week after the 2016 election, something like that. Yeah. But so it does, reading it feels like this different world than what we live in. Yeah.
And I think that's optimistic for us as well, as we look to, Lord willing, one day when some of the heaviness that perhaps living this way, practicing these daily practices in the ordinary moments of life, which is absolutely the invitation that Jesus has made to all of us. Maybe as we live into that, we become the kinds of people who can handle the kinds of difficulties that our world is encountering increasingly in more public ways. So that's my hope. I know with Soul Care, for many, many years, I've been advocating different core spiritual practices and things like that are meant to live into ordinary life. There was a project that John Ortberg and Ruth Haley Barton initially published with the Willow Creek Association that was just called An Ordinary Day with Jesus, but similar hopes of anchoring our practice into ordinary life. And I stepped into a lot of that content and was teaching it in a variety of places, and just super helpful for people. But your book really struck a nerve. It helped us really think about those daily moments where our sense of God's presence with us might be completely gone, and ways to recover that and depend on that, rely on his presence and love and goodness and direction and correction right in the midst of those ordinary moments. So guys, you gotta get a hold of this. And I should also say, you have a website where everybody can find out more about your books. It's I think it's just your name, tishharrisonwarren.com, right? Yeah. So go over there. Very, very, very great things. The last thing I want to say is my background is not, at least my adult ministry background, is not as liturgical as my childhood was. And many of the folks on our call today probably are not from a more liturgical background. Just maybe give us a quick synopsis when you think of us as that audience of people who, that's not a word we think of much in our lives. What's like the way to like, I could answer this, but I think it'd be better if you do. How would you want us to frame our thinking about the concept of liturgy in ordinary life?
Yeah. So I think I talk more about this in the book if people are interested, but I do think all churches have liturgy. I grew up Southern Baptist, and the church in Texas, so the church I was in would have really found itself sort of almost anti-liturgy. It would have really found its identity and response that we're not like that, right? And yet, if I've said this elsewhere, but if I got sick one Sunday and stayed home, I could tell you within like 5 minutes of accuracy what was happening at my church at any given time, right? And even like friends who go to really charismatic churches, I think liturgy is about the idea of repetitive formative practices. So repetitive meaning we do things again and again, which again, like even sort of free form churches often fall into sort of patterns. We know when we walk into a room that if there's chairs, we know how to sit down, right? We know when a service is over, we know what to, when people pray, people either stand up or sit down or raise their hands or speak in tongues. Like all of these are things that people know. If you dropped in like an alien from Mars, they wouldn't know these things, right? But these are repetitive practices that we have learned together. So I said repetitive formative, meaning they form us, they shape our imaginations primarily, they shape our idea of the good life, as James K. Smith would say in his work, which my work very much draws from. And and their practices, their stuff we do, which is just a name that I think doctrine is completely essential in the Christian life, but that most of our life isn't spent reciting creeds or even necessarily living out of the creeds. Oftentimes what we proclaim, we believe is belied or is changed or is shaped by the stuff we do over and over again, the way that we're shaped. So I have a story in my book about sort of first thing reaching over and grabbing my smartphone and the way that kind of shaped me and my response to the day, my view of the good life, my imagination of who I am in the world, what I am as a consumer of technology. But it wasn't creedal. I wouldn't have said like, I believe in Steve Jobs, maker of heaven and earth, right? And so a lot of what shapes us is actually deep beliefs, deep doctrines, but not, they're not through cognition, they're through the stuff we do. They shape us. And so liturgy is simply repetitive formative practices, the stuff we do again and again that forms us. And I would also just add that when churches don't have liturgy, if you don't think critically about your liturgy, you end up picking up liturgies from something else. So the corporate world, or from TED Talks, or from rock concerts, like all of these are cultural liturgies that we understand. And so we end up just siphoning off of those because everything that we really enter into is a shaping practice.
Is formative. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And just knowing that many of you who are listening are yourself involved in leadership, that might be a new thought for you, that the way you do whatever you do, the form of it has a shaping quality in and of itself. And there may be a variety of sources that have shaped you in your understanding of what that looks like. And I think while the focus of that book in the ordinary is deeply accessible to all of us, I love when pastors and leaders, ministry leaders, and guys, I hope you're hearing this from us today, when you might also start to examine the ordinary moments of your life and realize the potential for shaping, or actually not potential, the fact of shaping that is happening through those ordinary moments. And sometimes, we think of the ministry work we do strategy planning, we do vision casting, we write messages, we deliver them. We have all these sets of things that we do, but you do that in the midst of ordinary days. And those ordinary days include fighting with your spouse and losing your keys and a lot of the other things, having maybe a cup of coffee or tea. That the jet fuel drinkers tend to drink more coffee is my experience. But whatever it is, finding that beauty, finding God in the midst of that, I hope that will be an area that you'll want to explore moving further. So with that, fun to explore that. Love it. Hope everybody dives a little more into that topic. I think that's an example of the ordinary moments are the backstage. They are the backstage that is shaping who you are when you show up on the front stage of your life, the part of you that is in performance mode, performing a task, not necessarily performing in a bad way, but showing up to be productive in some way. And so the backstage is full of those ordinary moments. But Tish, the more recent book that you had is with InterVarsity Press. It was just released, I think, in January of this year. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I need to get my hands on it. I haven't yet. And it is all about sort of the more difficult aspects of encountering God and holding space for hope and faith and peace in the midst of suffering. And that's a pretty different, it's consistent with where you've been in the past, but this is a different kind of book. Tell us a little bit about how this came into being and why you were so passionate about the topic.
So this book came somewhat out of my own life experience. And in 2017, it was just a hard year. It wasn't. There's a lot of books about suffering that are specifically about kind of really intense tragedy. So the loss of a small child, or terminal illness, or this is not a book about that. It's more ordinary suffering. Speaking of ordinary suffering, but difficult suffering nonetheless. It was a year. We moved across the country, and then a week for a job in a church, actually, and a week later, my dad back in Texas passed away suddenly, and then a month later we had a miscarriage, and we had long wanted a third child, and so we were surprised when we got pregnant, and then about 3 weeks later we had a miscarriage. There was like medically dramatic. I get into it in the book, but I had to be rushed to the hospital, and I had to have surgery, minor surgery, and it was kind of intense. And then we got pregnant again and had a long, hard pregnancy. I was on medically restricted activity for part of that, and then July of that year we lost our second son. It was a boy in our second trimester. So that was about 6 months of just of struggle, of difficulty. Things a lot of people face moving across the country, loneliness, that's common. If we live long enough, all of us lose a parent at some point. 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in miscarriage, so that's actually quite common. But one of the things that I mentioned in the book that you find is that because something is common doesn't actually help you walk through it at the time. And so it was a hard few months, and I was in ministry throughout the season, and I found after about later, kind of in that fall, I was just spiritually I was exhausted. I was depleted, and I found it really, really difficult to pray. And I found it difficult to pray because there weren't words to kind of touch the deepest place of ache in me. But more than that, I think I was struggling with, how do I trust God in the middle of this? And so I was dealing with what theologians call theodicy, right? Which probably most of us on this as Christian leaders have encountered that term, the idea of how can God be all powerful and profoundly good, and bad things still regularly happen in the world, which I had read books on. I had at this point a seminary degree. I was ordained. So I had the answers, but I just found them deeply emotionally unsatisfying.
Yeah.
And so the book is kind of about that question of, if we can't trust God to keep bad things from happening, how do we trust God at all? But it's a really practical take on that. And so instead of a sort of philosophical answering of the question, for me, that looked like, how do I continue to walk in the way of Jesus when I have all these questions and I'm not sure how to trust God, and I do find this emotionally unsatisfactory, and I'm not sure how to pray. How do I keep praying when prayer feels really hard and really empty, mostly empty? And so one of the ways I did that is I took up, or I had kind of practiced this on and off throughout the years, but I returned to the Anglican nighttime prayers, the Office of Compline, which it's not really an apologetic for Compline or a book about Compline. It's fine if you don't pray Compline at the end of this book, but it receiving the prayers of the church and the liturgy of the church gave me kind of practices of faith when I couldn't conjure up ardor, when I couldn't conjure up, good feelings about the Christian life. And so, this one particular prayer in Compline is just beautiful and became important to me, called it begins, "Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night." And so the book is framed around that prayer, with each chapter being a phrase in that prayer. But I kind of use the prayer, and instead of it being about the prayer per se, I use the prayer to get into these bigger questions of how do we trust God? How do we meet God in suffering? How do we continue in the way of Jesus when we're full of doubt and grief? That's the book.
No, thanks for that context, and thank you for your vulnerability with all of us here in this environment. I guess you've written about it, but it's still, it hits me to hear all those things that would have happened to you in such short sequence. And folks, I'm hoping you can identify with the compounding of hard circumstances on the backstage. We've been many times repeatedly talking about the things of this past year, of decision fatigue, of pivoting constantly, of the no-win position that pastors have been in trying to lead their congregations, and whether they land on one side of an issue or another, they're continually being met with opposition. It's just been a really, really, really hard, compounding, hard, unrelenting, relentless season of hard, in which we're still looking for beauty, looking for peace, but the stuff under our own roofs has gotten increasingly hard. Like, it has just been a season like that. And that's we're gonna, in a minute, she's gonna walk us through this prayer of Compline and this particular one. And I think you'll find it to be, I hope, something that becomes something that you could maybe consider practicing in the night. I know one of our broadcasts, we talked about how difficult, even just, we wake up in the middle of the night more often with so many things on our minds. And we've talked about praying through the Lord's Prayer or praying through the 23rd Psalm. But I think what Tish is going to uncover for us from the history and wisdom of the church throughout the ages will be something that is intensely practical for whatever compounding difficulties you may be going through right now. Before we get into that, I just want to remind you, if you want to like this or share it on Facebook and chime in with comments or questions, you can tell this is a place where we're trying to be really honest about where the rub is for us with the difficulties of life and leadership, and staying in this place of love and devotion and hope and optimism in our relationship with God, but not from a false or tinny or forced place, but from a place of authenticity. So that's just a little pause to let you know how to help us get the word out about this. But Tish, wonder if you could walk us through that prayer, and then sort of phrase by phrase what it has meant for you, and any tips you have on how folks might use this.
Okay. I mean, mostly I would say you should read the book, because I'm not going to be able to sort of summarize everything.
Oh no, you don't need to summarize everything, but I meant the prayer itself.
The prayer goes, it's "Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying, soothe the suffering, pity the afflicted, shield the joyous, and all for your love's sake. Amen." So there's a lot to get into there. I mean, the book is divided into four different sections. And I start with sort of talking about Compline and telling the story of that I just told you of what happened in 2017. But then I kind of drill down in the second part. I look at these words: working, watching, weeping, like for those who work, for those who watch, and those who weep. And I pick those apart in terms of I've actually, like, this is not, the writer of this prayer did not intend for this to be kind of a, I don't know, some sort of, well, certainly not like a cliche, but also not like a gimmick.
For sure.
But for me, praying those over and over for years, I really come to see those postures of weeping, watching, and working as kind of the defining postures of how we as Christians enter into and live in human vulnerability, and in what I call in the book the mystery of theodicy, this idea that God doesn't take away our vulnerability. And I mean vulnerability here, not just in terms of deciding to be vulnerable or share vulnerability, but vulnerability that all of us have, from, you know, the most sort of seemingly vulnerable person to John Wayne or Mr. T, right? They're still vulnerable in the sense that they I mean, the word is from the Latin to wound, and it's woundable, right? That we can all be deeply wounded in body and mind and spirit. We all die, which is the ultimate example of human vulnerability. And we all can't live alone, right? We're all dependent on one another. None of us would live to see adulthood without people taking care of us along the way. So vulnerability is this this inescapable part of being human. And God didn't have to make it that way, and he could have taken that away. We could be saved and then unable to be wounded. And yet he doesn't, right? And so I talk about then how do we endure this, and this gets into, in the book I talk about theodicy as not just kind of it's not a theological issue that we're trying to solve like an algebra equation, right? We're not just solving for X. I talk about it as almost like a primordial scream, this deep desire in us to see God act, for God to work and to move and to set all things right. I think at the end of the day, theodicy is a very real longing for something true, which is for Jesus to make all things new, for God to act, for God to see us and respond. So, but we're not there yet, right? No. And so how do we live in the midst of this? And so these postures of weeping, watching, and working, I go into more, but I see them as Christian practices. I've really come to see grief and lament as a Christian practice, and watching for God at work as a Christian practice, and then work, joining God in his work. So that, and then the next part of the book, I go through all these postures of vulnerability that the prayer names, from sleeping to weariness to dying to suffering to affliction, and even joy. That joy itself is a vulnerable posture. It takes courage. It's and it feels risky. Joy feels risky and is risky, I would say, this side of heaven. And so and then the last part of the book, which is the culmination of the book, the culmination of the prayer, I think also the culmination of ultimately all our questions of theodicy, is about the love of God, all for your love's sake. And so that's sort of generally how
Tish,
the book goes.
That's great. Thank you so much for explaining that. And thanks, guys, for sticking with us while we're trying to get that up there so you can read it. It's fine to keep it up there if you'd like further. But here we are, we're a year plus into a pandemic, all the things that have happened, the levels of fatigue, mental health issues are continuing to become more and more pressing among leaders and among everyone. Where do you think our theology as leaders gets challenged by a willingness to enter into this kind of vulnerability? Mm-hmm. When you think about this from a leadership perspective, where's the rub?
Yeah. Well, there's different ones kind of depending on your own context. I mean, one of the things I've seen even this past year is just tendency for pastors and leaders to just want to make everything normal, just want to make everything okay, just kind of alleviate the tension of pain of, but it's going to be all right, but it's going to be okay. You know, I see this all the time with parents with their children, of sort of instead of letting their children sort of feel grief, trying to distract them with, but it's okay, but it's happy, or my sister actually was writing a piece over Christmas about kind of how to help your kids through Christmas during COVID, right? Because there's so much they can't do. And was talking to me about it. And I think, of course, I mean, make Christmas as joyful as it possibly can be. We had a great Christmas with our kids. And yet I also said, you know, there's something though of just wanting, we just don't want our kids to feel sad, or don't want our kids to feel lost. That is malformative. Like if this whole generation gets through a global pandemic with hundreds of thousands of deaths and thinks, well, that was just a great time, we're raising narcissists, right? Like there is something where we need to actually experience this time as painful. And so I think we can do the same with our people in the congregation, of just wanting to make everything okay. And it's not okay. And we need to let things be sad and let things be unfixed. And a mantra during the beginning, especially of COVID, around our home, because we were, you know, oh, I know it's so hard. Like we were just trying to do all the stuff of, you know, move the service online, and have all of a sudden you're having, you know, intense pastoral conversations over Zoom, which is just awful. And figuring all of that out, and everyone in your congregation has completely different thoughts on this, and then it sort of became, there was like this one moment where everyone was sort of pulling together, and that lasted like a second, and then everyone kind of fractured, and it got really polarized, and so during all that, we just kept saying, you know, my husband would say, you know, this just feels wrong. And I would say, you know, it feels wrong because it is wrong. It's not wrong because we're doing something wrong. It's wrong because we aren't meant to live in a world where we have to adjust to global death and global pandemics. Like, we are tasting the fall here. We're tasting the reality of the curse of the world. We're part of all creation groaning. And so there is a sense of things feel wrong because they are wrong. And we need to let that, if we try to paper that over and make it okay, we're actually denying part of the Christian story, which is things are not the way they're supposed to be. And there's not any amount of American consumerism or ingenuity or positivity or stick-to-itiveness that's going to change that. Like, there's just a deep brokenness that the only hope is the redemption of Jesus. And we need to let people feel the pain of that. And we as leaders need to let ourselves feel the pain of that, and not get so busy trying to make everything okay for ourselves and everyone else that we're avoiding feeling the pain. I mean, it's just been a painful year. Barna research this was probably 6 or 7 months ago, so I'd love to see if there's an updated statistic. But my friend, Dave Kinnaman there is a friend of mine, and he mentioned in an interview with me that I think it was 40 or 50% of pastors said that in the month before they had experienced depression, that they had felt depressed or despair.
Yeah, we have a strong partnership with Barna here at Glue, and you know, David's been in the offices within the last month or so, I think, and the statistic I've heard recently is that 7 out of 10 pastors, like this is like within the last 2 months, are seriously considering leaving that vocation. And I think it must largely be to what appears to be quite unwinnable circumstances. It's like, how do I personally live? My family is struggling. I'm struggling. I don't see a way forward. And I am wondering what recommendations you have to help leaders maybe move away from that busyness and drivenness, and in some ways way of medicating all that pain through our busyness? And what are the ways that we could choose a different path that allows us to enter into the weeping and the waiting, or watching and the waiting? What are some things that you think leaders could enter into more in this season?
Yeah. So I say in the book, I tell the story of a poet. She was on the Mayflower. Her name is Mary Allerton, and she was a pilgrim, and came over and had a stillborn child, a stillborn son, and wrote a poem in response. This is some of the very first words written in the English language on American soil. And it begins, "There is no time for grief. There is no time. There is only time for labor in the cold." And I was sitting with someone, I mentioned this in the book, but I don't say in the book that she's a Christian leader. She was someone on staff at a church. And I was sitting with her, and she was in my office and said to me, she was talking about this deep pain she was experiencing in her own life and her own family, and said, "But I don't have time to feel that. I just have to keep working. I have to keep on doing ministry." And it just struck me, because I had just read this. There's these two people, both women, but it equally applies to men, I can tell you, that 400 years apart, we're saying almost the exact same words, the same language. Yeah. And it was that I don't have time to feel this. I have to keep going. And I think that we can do that as pastors. I did that. After my father's death, I took 1 week off for the funeral, and then I was back and added speaking gigs because the book had just come out, and was busy. And I think I'm deeply concerned about the concept of sort of the professionalization of ministry. I'm not even sure if that's the right term, but when we mostly try to make ministry look quantifiable and busy, I'm reading Burning in My Bones, the biography of Eugene Peterson right now, and it talks about this great story of when his daughter, who was 5 at the time, asked him to read her a story, and he said he couldn't. He had an elders meeting that night, and she said, "This is the 27th day that you've had a meeting and haven't been able to read me a story." And so he goes to church and to the elders meeting angry, and he resigns that night and says, "I'm not doing this anymore." And the elders said, "Well, what do you want your ministry to look like?" And he said, I want to be a pastor who prays, who has time to pray. I want to be a pastor who sits in silence and can feel this, right? Can process this grief. I want to be a pastor that can study, that can read important old works, that can sit in scripture. I want to be a pastor who's unhurried, who can be with people and not feel like I have to just manage it and try to get out of the conversation. I want to be slow, and I want to be able to read my daughter a story every night. And they said, "Well, why don't you just do that?" And he said, "I got to run this damn church." I'm sorry to say that, but that was the quote in the book.
You're quoting Eugene Peterson. I think it's pretty cool that you can swear.
And they said, "Well, why didn't you let us do it?" And he said, "Well, because you don't know how." And they said, "Well, it doesn't seem like you're doing that great of a job either."
What a great story.
It ended up, what I'm saying is he completely rethought the way he did ministry so that his priority was having time, spacious time. We have a friend who is a pastor in Waco, and he's really challenging me because a lot of his day looks open. A lot of his day looks like, from my ministry background, which was very you have goals and you meet them, and And he's not a lazy guy at all. In fact, the fruit of his ministry is really beautiful. But a lot of it is prayer, and a lot of it is slowness, and a lot of it is just sitting with people. And I feel like basically what I'm saying is that if we don't deal with our own stuff, if we don't look at our own grief, if we don't have a lot of time in prayer, have our own spiritual directors and counselors, have our own times of silence, if we don't, to use the words of my book and Mary Allerton, if we don't make time for grief, it doesn't go away. It ends up just coming out sideways. It ends up coming out as anger, as despair, as unbelief, as getting very angry at our staff and the people around us, or our families. Addiction is often a response to this, and even workaholism, right? And so we can't bring others into this deep life of meeting Jesus in vulnerability unless we're regularly meeting Jesus in our own vulnerability. And so this isn't the stuff. I'm saying this, and I am a pastor. I've been on staff at churches, so I know how I would hear this. All pastors agree with this. Everyone agrees with what I'm saying. Nobody's like, no, we don't need prayer as part of, but it always ends up being kind of like the 2 hours you're trying to like fit in, somewhere in a week. But what I'm saying is that's just, it's inadequate. It is not enough time, and it should be the foundation. And then everything else is just periphery to really sort of walking with Jesus and in silence prayer, but also things like being available to people. But I also think being available for your own, like making space for your own grief, having your own, I think every pastor needs their own spiritual director that they're kind of walking with through their own stuff.
I agree.
So that's some way. I mean, read Eugene Peterson's biography. I don't have a solution to this because I know the reality of things, but I also think, here's what I think. I think there's an insecurity in us as ministers of the gospel. I have this too, where we're afraid people think we're lazy or we're not working hard enough, and so we can try to justify our existence by our busyness. And I think we should be real skeptical of that, but also just sort of like, in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of like capitalist busy America, we're going to look superfluous because the deepest things of God are look like a waste of time. But those are the very things that Jesus spent so much of his time on. And also, I think that is where God gives us life that we have to offer other people. And so I think somewhat I'm saying, like, let's rethink every way we do ministry in America. But
I'm on board with that.
But I think maybe that is a little bit what I'm saying. I really do.
Say it strongly. I think the there's a moment that we're in right now in the body of Christ that is going to call for some new wineskins with some fresh wine. And I think the reason I hope that your first book and this one have been so well received, and many other resources that are in this more formational new way of life. It's not the most dominant voice in the church leadership space yet, but I think the reason it's gaining ground, and somebody put a lovely comment in here as you were describing what kind of pastor Eugene Peterson wanted to be. They said, I'm desperate for such a pastor. Like,
that's right.
I think we're ready for what's next and what's new. And if we try to get to what's next and what's new by just working harder and relying on our own analysis and our own innovation and all that stuff, it's very possible we'll miss the very thing that God is doing in our day.
Yeah.
And I love that vision that you're portraying. And I know for my way of saying some of those things, in my own season many years ago, and I've had a recent one more recently, but many years ago, like just coming to the point where I was done being so intentional and strategic and harnessing my gifts. Like I had to completely jettison all of that because it had landed me in the hospital with neurological problems, which was not God's fault. It was me living out of my human strength and trying to meet the demands of ministry and family and life from that. And I remember I didn't really know another way. I didn't have the grace and the gifts that you have, but I became convinced that I needed to learn how to care for my soul. And I remember realizing that I felt really feisty even about a deep refusal of doing this other path.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm just going to build as deep a relationship with God as I know how. I had no idea how. I didn't know what a spiritual director was. I didn't know how to do days of solitude. I didn't know how to pray in silence. None of that, those things that have become vital to me now, none of them were part of my life at that point.
I know. This is why we should be teaching in seminary, right? No one should leave seminary without knowing what these things are, and also theology. But
yeah, well, both are important. And I just said, I'm going to build as deep a relationship with God as I know how, and he can do through me whatever he jolly well pleases. I'm done caring. And there was a letting go of outcomes, as Dallas Willard speaks of, and a freedom to just sort of rest in God, be willing to look superfluous, be willing to look ridiculous, and then just see. And that's what I think we today are bringing as a hope for everyone, is that is the invitation of Jesus, that there is a yoke that you would shoulder in which the burden ends up being easy and light, and it is his work that we're participating in, but we're not striving and forcing and all those things. So
Can I say one more thing about that too, which is just that pastors, I think in particular, because we shoulder our own burdens, but also the burdens of our congregations, right? Yeah. And so there is kind of a secondary grief that's real. That's a real thing, and so I've seen pastors just burn out after funeral after funeral after funeral after funeral. You know, or when you're dealing with broken marriages in your congregation and tragedy and pain, even if it wasn't someone who was your best friend or someone you were really close to, but sort of being in those spaces over and over again, it's a total gift. It's a total privilege, but it is also a burden. And so I just want pastors to kind of be aware, even if you think, well, you know, my life's pretty good, that first of all, I get into this, read my book. I get into this in the book, but I think all of us have grief, even in the most, I don't have a life that's marked by particular kind of suffering, or I wouldn't ever be like a Hallmark movie, right? Like I've never had that much suffering and tragedy, but all of us have grief. But I also think we take on a lot of burden, and so we have to make space to process that emotionally, but also spiritually, and to face the pain of that, because that's part of our of entering the vulnerability that is part of our vocation, is that we are just human, and yet we're called into this space of bearing the burdens of a community. And so I think in particular, pastors need to be well equipped to do this kind of work, because we are constantly like walking with the grief of other people as well.
Yeah, that was one of the questions that came in here, is is it what is our recommendation for leaders carrying those kinds of things? And I think part of what we're saying here, guys, is that you may need to enter a bit of a deep refusal of the busyness and the drivenness, and actually for the sake of others, for the love of God, for the world, to enter into your own pain and difficulties, and which sounds about as exciting and fun as it is. It's hard, it's pain, but it's encountering reality rather than living in some constructed non-reality.
And I certainly don't hear me saying, if people in your congregation are going through a divorce or having a death in the family, that you don't spend time with them to try to deal with your own busyness. In fact, that's the opposite of what I have experienced in ministry, but also what Peterson was talking about. Is I think we can get so busy with elders meetings and parking. Parking was always like a big struggle in our church, figuring out parking, or like the administration, the running of things, dealing with buildings and budgets, that we, and in particular, if we have big congregations, that would get into another question of like, how big should your congregation be before you plant or split or whatever. But I think multiply, not split. But I think we open up space so that we can receive even the grief or the pain of our congregation, and not resent it or not feel like it's a burden. I remember a time in ministry where I felt like I was beginning to resent my people for having needs, and I had to catch myself and go, oh geez, it's like, because these were legitimate needs. I'm resenting people from needing me, and it's because I don't have space for them to need me. But it's not wrong for them to need me. I mean, it's not wrong for them to need care, pastoral care. And so at that point, you either radically shift what you're spending your time doing so you have more space for actual care for people, or you have to hire someone who that's their whole job and that's what they do, or whatever.
Well, guys, if this has been helpful to you, we hope it has been for sure. Want to highlight this fresh new book from Tish Harrison Warren, and I think you'll find it meets you exactly where we're at and where you're at. I know my last 8-9 months have met me in the middle of the night with some harder times and facing my own resistance to grief, and what does that need, how do I confront that and move into it. Maybe another topic for another time, but if anybody is interested in more about spiritual direction and doesn't have access to a director in your place, there's lots of ways, good directories to get access to a spiritual director, but also soulcare.com, my organization, we have a team of maybe 8 different spiritual directors that do everything virtually, and they all come from fabulous programs around the country. And all also understand the unique and important challenges that are inherent in leadership. So again, Tish's book is Prayer in the Night for those who work and watch or weep. And Tish, just thanks again so much for being with us today. Any last comment you want to make before we close up? Final word?
I don't know. My word would be that any place of darkness that you can go, Jesus has been there first. And I saw there was one more question that I didn't get to.
Grab it.
That do you think the tendency of Christians to try to ignore or dismiss difficulty and suffering is linked to our inability to address issues of injustice in our world that are so apparent right now? I mean, in a word, yeah, they are probably linked. I think that's true. But I think that gets into, we really struggle to name honestly the sin and brokenness in the world, and in our own lives as well, and in the world. And so, and there's reasons that we do that. Some of them are like emotional defenses. Some is we want to make the resurrection look really good. We want to make the church look really good, right? We don't want to, and so we can sort of be God's PR spin firm or the church's PR spin firm, trying to make us look better than we are, or feel like we need to protect the reputation of God by just only focusing on resurrection. But if we do that, we inevitably end up belittling. If you belittle death and darkness, you belittle redemption and resurrection. And so Christians need to be better about naming the depth of sin in the world. And that includes injustice and deep systemic like demonic and systemic disparity and inequality, and also sin in our own lives. And when we end up belittling that or trying to paper over that to make it not so bad, we end up not seeing how beautiful Jesus is, how much we need him to make all things new. And so don't be afraid. I guess that's my final word. Like my husband said to me, so much of the world, he said this week, so much of the world of this kind of toughness that we project is because we're just really scared of feeling pain. And I think we're also afraid as a church, we're afraid of being all kinds of things, of being marginalized. We're afraid of losing power. But there's one thing I feel like the church needs to hear right now. It's do not be afraid. And I say that not because the world isn't really, really dark, but because God has given us everything we need to walk into those really dark places and to be honest about them.
Beautiful. So well said. Everyone, thanks for joining us again today. We'll be back next week with Backstage, a really honest conversation about leadership and how the backstage is what determines the front stage. So thanks for joining us today. Check out some of the resources that we will post below the recording of this, and share it out with your friends if you found it valuable. And please keep in touch with us. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.